So one of the things I'm really excited about is I get to spend most of my day thinking about open source security. And I think most of the industry as exists today focuses on two things: license compliance and known vulnerabilities. And one of the big things that attracted me to industry is when you think open source security, it's far more than a vulnerability management and license compliance. So my goal today is to double click on an OWASP A6, which is known vulnerabilities, to help you get a real feel for what goes beyond the compliance obligations that most of us face today in order to understand real security. So what's the motivation here? Software is ultimately eating the world, as everyone has heard, but a study by SAP shows that 86% of software is open source and only 13% is proprietary. Now, that being said, this is across 77,000 applications within SAP. And if you're not familiar with SAP, this is an organization that has many business units. Each of them are effectively a different business. So this is a proxy for what exists within the world, but may not be your case. The reality is, though, that on a granularity of lines of code, when you think the percentage that is open source and the percentage that is internal code, what you'll see is that there's a huge skew toward open source today. So this is over 80% of the software that we develop, but the reality is that most of us are undereducated when it comes to actual management of open source security risk. So why do we need another top 10? Quick answer me question for you. How many OWASP top 10 projects do you think there actually are in existence? Are you going with 5? And what about you?
I'll say over 7.
It is lower than that, I will tell you that much, but it is far higher than yours.
If this
Both.
Is I'll go into 6.
I love it. So the right answer is actually 33. And if you think there's 33 OWASP top 10s, well, why do we need another one? I think we know that the OWASP top 10 is an awareness and education project. The importance of open source software has really dictated the need for a dedicated practice. And we see that today in a large number of organizations, but I want to reframe today how you think about open source software management and help you to double click on what A6 known vulnerabilities and outdated components actually means. So what do we consider an open source dependency for the context of this talk? An open source dependency is anything that is being pulled and executed either for distributed code or test code. So that can be anything from a runtime dependency at the app level to a third-party script to a snippet of code that's being copied from the internet. And go ahead.
Would that be the Zen hypervisor that I'm running that application on as well, since that's open source, or is that not part of the stack that you're thinking about?
That's not part of what I'm thinking about today. So we frame 10 open source risks that most people aren't aware of through a review of over 30 CISOs, and these are believed to be the 10 most prevalent problems when it comes to open source risk management. Now, I have to start with known vulnerabilities. It's the first one on the list. Everyone does touch on it. I'm going to assume for a second that all of you know what these are and not overburden it. What I do want to talk about when it comes to known vulnerabilities are the things I don't think you know about. That is, the industry has a data quality problem. We as an industry look to the NVD and look to awareness programs in order to actually understand what we should focus our time on. But the reality is that we have one core problem in industry. A known vulnerability, and the biggest proxy that we use for risk is the CVSS score. We say, because you have a known vulnerability with a component that is in your application, that you actually should focus your attention and fix this thing. It doesn't consider the context. Is this actually exploitable? Is this used in the context of my code? And is this actually something I should even focus my attention on in the first place? The reality is that we have this conversation. can you change this package? It has an issue. Thanks, but I don't use it that way, and you have a 30-day SLA. This is what we live. But what are these data quality issues, and how can we start to reframe this? This is what reality is. 828 out of 13,000 OSV vulnerabilities do not have a CVE alias. That means 1,000 vulnerabilities, roughly, are identified in a GitHub advisory that do not have a CVE. So we have data conflicts that exist in industry today. And we can see simply how these are across various ecosystems, with JavaScript being what GitHub supports and owns, having more reports. So this is Microsoft being more responsible, but the CVE process coming and having a lag. What else are the problems? And just before I even show this, what percentage would you guess where known vulnerabilities have an exploit before a CVE is published? Any takers on what percentage actually has an exploit prior to publish? I'm going to start picking on people.
It's like 5%.
Only 5?
Start low.
Start low. Anyone want to go higher?
I would think it'd be more like 80. What was the question again?
What is the percentage of known vulnerabilities that have a published exploit prior to a published CVE?
Yeah, I imagine it's way more. You probably need one half the time to get up 20%.
I actually want to give that man a lightsaber to start him out, because he actually nailed it. It is exactly 80. I did not plant that man.
That's awesome.
So when you think of the mean time to resolution, 80% of public exploits are published before the CVs are published. So how are we going to manage things effectively? Our whole industry exists on a lagging indicator of risk. But this is not really the only thing we need to focus on. So this is a tax on organizations in order to stay protected and protect their brand. But the reality is, can this vulnerability be exploited in my application-specific context is not even the first question we're asking. We're just saying, just fix it. And to me, that's an anti-pattern that causes security teams to lose trust and credibility. So how do we reframe our organizations as a whole in order to say, can this vulnerability be exploited in my application? Because if you say a package version has a known vulnerability and it's 7 layers deep in a dependency graph, I mean, honestly, the last thing I think is that this is exploitable. I need evidence to say if something is ridiculously 4 levels deep. Otherwise, it's going to be tough to update. So there are signal enhancing techniques to do this, such as reachability analysis. But I don't want to spend my time there, because known vulnerabilities is what we as an industry overkill. I want to talk about the other indicators of risk in open source today. So known vulnerabilities is number 1 in the open source top 10. Number 2 is the compromise of a legitimate package. Now there are 2 ways to compromise a legitimate package. You can either develop and advertise that from code itself. So you build something useful that you intend to use as a call option to say, I am going to compromise this later. Or you can subvert a legitimate package. And that can be anything from, I am going to buy a domain of that maintainer and take their email address, all the way to I compromise their build system. But the reality is that this is the conversation that actually happens when devs download software. And this is why compromising a legitimate package is such an easy and scalable path forward for an attacker. I've been using this package for years. It's time to update. Cool, here you go. Just a regular update. Don't think about it. No one ever does. The reality is that most people do not have the time or the budget to actually invest in checking and auditing each new version of a software package. Usually organizations have thousands to tens of thousands to even hundreds of thousands. Someone at this software list told me, someone in this conference told me earlier today that they were asked to give an SBOM for their whole company. in an Excel spreadsheet, and they had to respond, this exceeds the limit of rows in Excel. You can't audit that. Yes, that was you. Exactly. And you can't audit that, and you can't audit the next new version each and every time. This is why it's an efficient attack. Malicious code gets executed on developer machines. Ultimately, this is an attack on developers trying to get credentials to access other things. It can be an attack to deface your site, sure, but this is commonly used as a lateral movement technique. What's an example of this? Everyone heard of XZ because it was overhyped earlier this year. It was overhyped because it was super cool. This is an example that highlights what could have been an absolute disaster, and we as an industry candidly got lucky. Someone casually auditing source code got super annoyed at a performance issue and managed to find a backdoor into a common library often installed on operating systems by default. Now, there's this, XZ exposed something about our industry. What happened here? There was a man who started contributing to that open source project. The open source project was maintained by a single individual who was candidly getting burnt. He needed someone to help him, and the person who actually was a planted attacker came in and said, I am going to help. And they contributed real code for a long time. They gained trust. Once they gained trust, they were escalated in their own permissions by doing so. And ultimately, they introduced a backdoor at night with a signed commit, and they issued a new release. And this was discovered prior to it actually getting to mainstream operating systems that most of the world uses. But because it was discovered, we lucked out. The reality is that this is commonplace. We have established a system of trust and a trust relationship with each open source software maintainer when we reuse their code. We ultimately reuse code for innovation quickly. It would actually be irresponsible for people to waste a $7 trillion industry asset that is free and publicly available. It's like saying, here's $7 trillion, you can pick a dollar off the wall if you want and use it. Why would you not? The reality is, though, that this is an accepted risk of industry. We have established this trust relationship with each open source maintainer, and as a result, we need to figure out ways to effectively monitor and detect them. It's unlikely that an organization is going to effectively prevent exposure to supply chain risk. This is a reality. This is something that you can help reduce the risk of. This is not something you can prevent the risk of. You can absolutely focus on strategies in order to reduce supply chain risk. And what do? You can build software from source. Most people find that to be incredibly difficult. People download software from Maven Central or NPM, and this is because it's easy. It's not cost effective to do this, but this is the right secure way. When consuming binary packages, or when consuming any package at all, you can pin versions. When you download software, so if you do an npm install in order to download JavaScript software, what happens? You don't get the same software downloaded each and every time. The software you download is dependent on three things. It's dependent on the exact time that you download it, because you're just going to get a later version from JavaScript, from NPM, if someone just publishes a new version of that open source software you use. Because that's how NPM works. It says, just give me the latest by default. You can mitigate that by using a lock file. But how many of you are JavaScript developers in the audience? So we've got about 4. How many of you do npm install in CI? So all of them are either nodding or raising their hand. An npm install is going to not create a reproducible build. It's going to download new software packages each and every time. So if you do npm CI, you use that lock file that is created that has integrity and download checks, that pins versions, and it tells you exactly what to do that you'd put on your laptop. The reality is that if we do npm install in CI, that's going to download something completely different potentially. So there are paths forward, like using that lock file, that can help us. But we need to educate our community on reproducible builds in order to reduce the risk of this. You can use an internal registry, and that's great. But how many of us are using JFrog? Can you just raise your hand if you're using JFrog or Nexus really quick? Only one of you. You're definitely lying now.
It's expensive.
I'm not here to talk about that, but fair. So the way to think about this is, if you're using an artifact repository internally, and you're not shutting down external public-facing artifact repositories, and you're not proxying everything through that artifact repository, then what happens if your developer simply doesn't have the right settings file on their local machine? They, by default, go to the external one and not your internal one. So what I see often is that people have a false sense of security. They say everything is proxied through JFrog. Everything is proxied through Nexus. And the reality is, maybe you have a standard process to do that, but that is not the default of every system of software ever in existence. So malware and vulnerability scans, I'm sure most of you do. This is common practice in industry. Name confusion is the next type of attack. And there's really 3 core ones I frequently hear about, even though there are several types of name confusion attacks. What does this look like? I say, good old URL lib3, 1.2.2. That's what I need. Here you go. You accidentally forgot the 3 in what you typed. So no one's going to notice that they forgot a 3 if they get it downloaded successfully. And this is the reality we live in. I mean, everyone who has a web proxy has experienced regular typo squatting attacks. Everyone and notices those and blocks those in a deny list frequently. Organizations are often buying domains that are really close to their domain to protect their own brand. This exists within open source too. To put it simply, for typo squatting, if you reference a GitHub action and you miss one letter, you can easily download a completely different action if you simply have something with the same repo name, but in a different organization. I actually own the Docker with the C and K transposed just to prevent this. So I hope you trust me, Docker, because I'm the one who would be typo squatting you otherwise. And what are examples of these? So how many of you are familiar with the concept of dependency confusion? Okay, so a small number. So what happens? When you reach out and say, I want this software, you have 2 things that are commonly in place. You have a package manager, which is on your system and in your environment that is responsible for downloading software in the right version that you request from what's called a package repository. Your classic package repositories are internally are JFrog and Nexus. In Java, you reach out to Maven Central. In Python, you reach out to PyPy. And in JavaScript, you generally are reaching out to NPM. PyTorch had a nightly dependency build. And if you don't know, PyTorch is a machine learning framework published by Meta. And Meta classically would not publish their dependent software to PyPy, which is the default of every package manager within the Python ecosystem. They hosted it and published it to their own internal repository and made it externally available. What did someone do? Someone just published something under the exact same name to PyPy, and a package manager first looks at PyPy by default and has a priority resolution where you say, look here first, and then in this package repository, and then in this package repository. All they did was say, oh, this is in the second one in the list. Let's move it up to the first and give you different software. Now, how do you start mitigating these things? Preventative squatting. As a security team, can you raise your hand if you've ever published a software package to the public internet that was absolutely null just to protect yourself? What if your developers are reaching out for a package in your internal repository? I used to work for Cigna, so I will make up a name. Let's say I am publishing Cigna 1 to my internal repository, and someone puts that exact same name on PyPy. This is how you can start to attack developers locally who forget to actually point to your internal repository by default. Preventative squatting is something the industry does not talk about. Candidly, I've tried to take a few of these, and the only one who has actually ever prevented me by squatting me is Microsoft. This is shocking to me, but the reality is that most security teams are still stuck on vulnerability management and license compliance and aren't asking themselves, what type of attacks does someone come in and change my repository? So I encourage everyone in this room to go back and ask, how can I take a namespace in NPM, and what are my important packages that I should preventatively publish to public repositories so that those names can't be taken, and so that those names can't be used as an attack on me in the future? What are other paths forward? Go ahead, ask a question.
So this is a naive question coming from a non-security person. So if I'm detecting vulns and exploits, and a dependency confusion attack happens, aren't I going to detect it anyway because I would detect whatever they're doing in that package while I'm scanning?
No. A known vulnerability publishing feed is going to do one thing. It's going to say, you have a software package version. I'm going to match that to a public database of software package versions that have issues. It is not once going to look and say, is this an internal package that is also potentially publishable elsewhere? This is not a tool that I've seen that exists in the market. Now, maybe there are some open source tools, but this is a security architecture strategy. This is not something that I've seen mass tooling for.
Thank you.
So, two more quick things before I go on. Typo squatting is easy. This is 60% of supply chain attacks that exist in the market, but it isn't the only thing. Name confusion is easy. Sentinel-1 had an STK published for them that they did not know about, and people trust Sentinel-1. Why wouldn't you trust the security vendor's SDK? And when people download that under their name, they are assuming the trust of brands. So name confusion is something that every organization should be aware of, because this is something that is so easy to attack. So what is, go ahead, ask a question.
Has any of the package managers implemented any type of cryptographic security on packages so you can verify that they're from the publisher?
Yes, so think of it this way. When you look at a lock file in a lot of, and this is not the repositories, it is the package managers generally. But when you look at a lock file in NPM, it does by default have a cryptographic, it does have a signature associated with it in the terms of its hash. So NPM lock files will have the exact version you expect and the SHA-256 hash. But that being said, as we surveyed the JavaScript developers, no one is using NPM CI, which would actually respect that. They're all NPM installing. So yes, these do exist. It is dependent on the package manager. So like, for example, Maven does not have this ability. It does not create lock files. But the majority of package managers in popular ecosystems that are a bit newer do have that. Python requirements.txt, for example, does not have that, but your Swift of the world will have a pod lock file. So I won't overdo unmaintained software too much. I do want to just point out one thing. Unmaintained software, this is the result of volunteers, and we can help them. Open source maintainers are unpaid volunteers, and they generally start their journey like this. I'm an unpaid volunteer. I love open source. Then people will come to them and respond as consumers of open source and ask them this. Thanks for your work. Can you answer my compliance questionnaire and help me fix these bugs? Because I need this in order to use your software. To me, as an open source maintainer, that's just not real life. I'm a volunteer. I have no obligation to you. You are reusing my software. I am not your vendor. You are not paying me. So at the end of the day, unmaintained software is just something we accept as a community. And I think the reality is that if you have unmaintained software and you depend on it, it generally comes with increased efforts, longer resolution time, and more time exposed because you own the fix. There is no shared responsibility model like there is in cloud with open source. If you use it, you own it. Maybe there is a community behind it, but the important thing is software reuse isn't software outsourcing. And here's a quick example of that Gorilla Toolkit. Gorilla Toolkit is the most popular HTTP service in the Go ecosystem. And this is just an ask for help from the maintainer saying, I just don't have time for this anymore. And if no one steps up that actually has been presented and is part of this project, meaning they're actually doing some reasonable due diligence to make sure that a random person in China does not start picking up the next open source that is used by everyone. They're saying, if I don't have any luck in the next 6 months, I'm going to mark these as archived. No one will contribute to this. And if there's bugs, there's vulnerabilities, well, good luck. The reality is that this project specifically did go archived. It actually recently started and got a new community and was unarchived. But the reality is that most organizations don't have mature vetting processes for this. Most organizations do not check the project liveliness and health. And most people don't search for explicit mentions of maintenance. So what are easy ways to identify if something is unmaintained? The repo is archived, you explicitly mark that as deprecated. But I mean, a lot of the time you just put in a README, I'm no longer doing this, good luck guys. And this is how we as an organization, and we need to know what we use, and if there's a community there to support us, or if we own it. And this is something that we as security industries need to be more responsible for. Outdated software. So I want to say one quick thing here in that we say just stay up to date. The reason why we talk about outdated software is not so that you are always on the latest. Like if you have something completely stable that has no issues and there's 100 versions ahead, like who cares? The reality is though, unless you have a bug or a new feature you want to take advantage of, there's no motivation to actually update. And the conversation a lot of people have is, hi, can you change this package? It has an issue. It's going to take a bit. I need to refactor my app. And people say, oh, well, there's a 7-day SLA policy. Good luck. And the reason why outdated software is important is because it gives us two things. One, if we need to take advantage of a new feature because the business evolves, we can do that more easily by staying reasonably up to date. And the second one is there are behavioral and syntactic types of breaking changes associated with software updates that frequently happen in the open source ecosystem. And the more that we are unreasonably out of date, the next time we actually have to go to the latest version in order to fix an issue, it's going to take us longer. So this is directly going to impact our mean time to remediation of known vulnerabilities. And it's also going to directly impact our ability to use new functionality in a software package that may exist that help us compete in that market later, especially if this software is important to our business. So it's important to stay reasonably up to date, but you need to actually understand the trade-offs. I want to pause here and teach a bit about breaking changes, and there are two types of breaking changes in the market, or just in industry in general. One is API incompatibility, and the other, which people call syntactic changes. And the other is behavioral changes, which people call semantic changes. This is an example of a syntactic change, type of breaking change, where there's a quick change in the service that's going to actually cause a compilation error if you use this. By a quick survey, who can identify this breaking change?
The difference between
Go ahead.
int and string.
The int constraint, and why is that important?
Well, because when you're calling it, if you are passing in the value of 3, 3 will hit the int. If you overload it, then the string, if it's in quotes, will be calling.
That's exactly right. And if this is the software that my client code is using, it's going to break. And this appears to be a relatively trivial refactoring. I just changed one word. This is an example of a behavioral breaking change. And who is the first person who can identify what the actual problem is? There you go.
You're changing the way you're rounding. The first one you're rounding the floor, the second one you're rounding whatever the round function is doing.
So that's exactly correct. If you have an application that has stable expected functionality, and suddenly it comes back and introduces brand new behavior without the API necessarily breaking, well, you're going to be in a scenario where you have to figure out, hey, how do I make my app work again? It no longer exhibits the behavior, and you're going to get bug tickets from your customers all day. So what does academia say about outdated software and breaking changes? Well, the truth is that test coverage is generally insufficient in the industry, and this is why it's hard for you to actually introduce a new known vulnerability fix. A study by Joseph Herjeb et al. If you guys don't know, academia et al. Is the coolest person who, and it's just a way of saying, and a bunch of other people who aren't the primary author. What this study showed is that test coverage of direct dependency, which means the software you implicitly choose to use, is only going to cover about 60% of calls. And if you're not familiar with best practice test coverage, Google, who is one of the most mature in industry, says you have acceptable test coverage at 60%. You have good test coverage at 70, 80% is outstanding. That's Google, guys. Most of us are working with somewhere between like 30 and 60% test coverage. For transitive dependencies, which are the software that your software that you reuse reuses, the test coverage drops dramatically in most applications to 21%. And this is a study of well-tested projects. When injecting simple faults into dependencies, test suites could only detect 47% of faults and 35% in transitive dependencies. So we as an industry have a test coverage problem. The reality is, though, that it's actually kind of prudent to not test everything, because your developers can get 100% test coverage, and then what are they going to be doing spending their time delivering business value? So breaking changes, though, aren't really sufficiently visible across the industry. A study by Orca et al. Revealed that 21% of breaking changes in Maven Central were not documented. So if you have to update a version and nothing works afterwards, well, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to go to the project and be like, what changed? And if it's not documented in a release ticket, you're stuck reading the code trying to figure it out. Now, sure, ChatGPT made that a little bit easier. But at the end of the day, the reality is that there's a large portion of issues that exist when you upgrade that just are invisible to most of the world. And sure, maybe you could start and try and create a database of potential breaking changes. But if they're not documented, good luck. Automated updates can also cause concern. So if I give you an example, what's a Dependabot do? What's a Renovate bot do? They say, just stay on the latest. And that's a good idea in principle. And it does help you be better than before. But that said, when you look at how software is updated, 62% of developers say breaking changes is a top concern, and developers are often overwhelmed with the feeling of needing to always stay up to latest. At Endor Labs, what did we do? We tried to do just update to latest always. And we turned that off because it broke too many things and it overwhelmed our developers with pull requests. Perfect. So I only have 10 minutes and I'm halfway through, so I will fly. What is open source risk number 6. We have untracked dependencies. You ultimately can't secure what you can't see. And a lot of times in a lot of ecosystems, people are installing software with makefiles, directly checking binaries in, and running bash scripts. And how the hell is anyone going to see that is really the reality. So if dependencies aren't tracked in a manifest file, they're still often installed. And here's such an example. Here, these people are trying to import YAML and installing things on the fly if it doesn't work. And the reality is, if we're trying to track known vulnerabilities at all, let alone other things, and you don't have visibility into that because people are doing things like this, well, that's a wonderful proposition in theory, but it sucks from a security risk management perspective. And rebundling is also something that is common in industry. So here is a list of the most common rebundled binaries in Python. And if you don't know what rebundling means, that just means that you are copying code over and then not tracking it in standard systems. So like in Java, a lot of classes are just copy-pasted over from certain packages to old ones. And that's what the concept of rebundling is. And when vulnerable classes are put in new software, well, a lot of the times people aren't actually checking for this. We generally don't have the systems to check for this. And while some people attempt to do that today, we struggle as an industry with this, period. I won't go into open source license compliance too much because people told me to remind you I am not a lawyer. That said, one of the things that exists in industry today that everyone should be aware of is licensing requirements. GPL licensed software cannot generally be redistributed without certain requirements being met and that code being publicly available. So important things here. Certain types of licenses dictate certain requirements. There are exact copyright notices that you do have to publish to many of your organizations when you distribute code. In general, you're much safer when you use something internally than when you distribute it, and there's a lot of requirements that are actually legally required when you redistribute code, such as putting public notice what software you have redistributed and giving credit where credit is due. And I will not go too deep into legal. I can talk with you offline if you actually care. Immature software is a reality in industry today. What do people do about that? If you look at this, all unit tests definitely pass. I'm a product manager. In my book, that's an MVP. It works, doesn't it? It doesn't fail until scale testing. But the reality is that there's a lot of software that's open source that is immature. So establish a good software vetting process and don't stay on the bleeding edge. That's the best advice that you can give for this. That being said, what a lot of organizations do is they'll actually set a time frame and say, hey, don't be on something that is as new as 30 days. Something has to exist for 30 days before, and that helps them to have some bug fixes prior to actually using it, and it helps them to prevent potential malware and have 30 days where someone else gets screwed over before they do. What is open source risk 9? This is unapproved changes. One of the funny stories I heard the other day was a large betting company had this was actually a large streaming company had a software that was reaching out to a subdomain that had been bought by a gambling company. Now, this wasn't malicious at all, but it was calling out to that gambling company's domain and just returning nonsense. And it was a non-impactful bug, so they never fixed it, but they always laughed about how their software had an intended use, and then the external domain was changed and bought by someone else and became a gambling company. So if your app stops working, it could just be because someone bought an external domain. And when it comes to what are unapproved changes and what should we track, we should track the actual usage of software itself. So what are sensitive API calls that we should track? File system writes, process creations, and network calls. The most mature organizations in the world do have these documented for each and every one of their software dependencies. That being said, that is the 1% of the 1%. The majority of us common muggles do not have that ability. So we have a visibility problem that does legitimately exist. And we need to start thinking about what are the network calls, what are the file system writes, and what are the actual process executions by our open source software. One, it's good practice. Two, it tells us what's changed in that open source software. And three, these are APIs that are leading indicators of malware. When Endor Labs does malware discovery, we are looking explicitly for these things, running it against an AI to filter out all the things, and reviewing things that AI says are potential malware manually. And this is how we identify malware in the open source ecosystem. And the last of the open source top 10, because I am running up on time and about to get yelled at, undersized and oversized dependencies are a real thing in most environments. Here's a quick example. I need to export data to a CSV. Common practice, right? Well, the response a lot of software packages give is, here's a platform for all things data manipulation. Here you go, you can now do anything. Your dev just needed to do a CSV export and reuse software to do that. So what does that look like? On average in the JavaScript ecosystem, for every open source software you reuse, you download 77 additional software dependencies. In Java, that drops to 14. In Go, that number is much closer to actually 3 on average. This is a very dependent on ecosystem thing, but each time we just use a little bit of software, we consume a lot of software. And here's a perfect example of this. isNumber is a small one-liner package. This is a super undersized dependency. But what is the impact of this? About 440 gigabytes of network downloads are saved each month by just copying the code rather than downloading it each time. This has a real environmental impact, and it reduces the supply chain risk. If this developer decides to go rogue, and I'm not saying he would, then we don't have to rely on him for what actually is this line of code. To me, that's something more teams should think about. The important thing is sometimes a little copying of code is better than depending on it because it reduces supply chain risk. It reduces noise associated with known vulnerabilities that exist in our environment. And it can help us all actually have faster build times, which improves our developer productivity. So I want to pause there. I know we've got a lot more, but I'll just skip that. I'll leave this up for people to read. What questions do you have? Anything I can talk to you about open source security? Anything you guys found you learned today? I still have 3 lightsabers to give out, so please ask questions.
Untrack dependencies. Essentially, we're talking about where they were explicitly included. Anything on the radar, or do you see the practices for detecting untracked dependencies that go across like SaaS service providers, all these low code, no code, where you're just directly injecting like jQuery, old jQuery package into like the HubSpot hosted website, and now that CDN that's hosting that is now exposing your organization?
So what I'll say is, no, I have not. There are some techniques that you can use to identify untracked dependencies, but it does depend on how they are actually used. So, for example, in Python, if you pip install 3 things and then install a requirements.txt, you can look at a virtual environment and actually see what's there. But if you look at vendored code, this becomes or rebundled code, this becomes an untracked dependency that you have to do approximation techniques for in order to actually understand if you use it. So like if you've ever heard of like snippet analysis, for example, that's what that is. But at the end of the day, what this creates is a false positive bias and a review process that must be put in place. So you get the trade-off of enhanced visibility, but you do need a program in place in order for that to be successful. Any more questions? I'm giving them out.
Your work in the industry, are you seeing a big shift from the antiquated CVSS scoring methodology from a prioritization perspective over EPSS?
No, I am not. I am seeing people start to supplement CVSS with EPSS. I am generally not seeing people make the switch. I'm sure there's a few people who have, but that said, the vast majority of people I work with are still focused on CVSS scoring. And that's also because there's compliance mandates around it. Like if you have FedRAMP, what are you going to do? You have to look at a CVE. Those 828 GIB security advisories that aren't tracked as CVEs, you don't have to care about them. So like this is the government mandate as well. So most organizations have that contractual flow down to look at CVEs. And as a result, they're not managing risk effectively, they're managing CVEs. Go ahead.
And speaking of compliance, about that last recommendation, wouldn't extract just what I need make it more difficult for me to comply with all the keeping track of all the third-party software, all the supply chain, and US bomb, etc.? Wouldn't that make it more difficult for me?
Which part?
So if I, instead of me making use of the entire functionality in my code, I just extract this, do the copy paste of what I need, wouldn't that put me at risk in compliance?
It depends. I do not genuinely know. That being said, most compliance or standards are going to use tools to track them, and most tools aren't now going to catch that. Now, you can still use leading indicators of risk, but the benefits generally outweigh it. How many compliance people are going to audit code, it does depend on industry. So like if you're Target, maybe no one's going to audit your code for a license check. But if you're a military contractor, someone's going to look at your code for license checks in all likelihood. So it is kind of industry specific at the end of the day, but most tools will not catch that.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, when you're talking about starting to look into the dependencies and tracking, like, are they writing files, making API calls, things like that, it's very much like a spider web type thing that I feel like if I went to my developer and said we should start doing this, they'd kick me out of the meeting. Mm-hmm. How do you kick off that initiative?
You kick off that initiative with an internal platform team. Those are the ones I've seen most successful. Otherwise, it's part of your open source vetting process, and it is going to be difficult to have something like that. Let me reframe that for a bit. A lot of organizations that are in trust, in safety-related industries, like if you're a car manufacturer, or if you're a military manufacturer, you are actually generally vetting your dependencies to a much greater extent. But that said, I'm going to use Target as an example. Like Target doesn't have as stringent of a program there because there's not necessarily the business need for trust. I actually don't know Target's specific industry, so don't quote me on that, Target, if you're listening. I didn't say it. I don't actually know. But that's the way I think about it in terms of industry. So if you have an open source vetting process, which does require some buy-in, these are things that you start to look for and document. And if you're looking at new versions, great. But the way I see a lot of people who are in less stringent industries do it is they will start and audit it once as part of an open source vetting process, and then have regular new bake-offs for newer versions on time cadences. And that's how you start to trade off the cost prohibitiveness of some of those expectations. So re-auditing specific software that's important to you is a way to do that. The other path that I've seen is people start to trust things with stronger communities and audit the tailing end of things that don't have strong communities behind them. So like if there's a open source Spring, I'm generally going to trust that coming from and everyone in the world looking at that more than a fringe unique package that I use for something that I just copied from the web because it was easy to use. No problem.
All right, I gotta wrap you up. Everyone, let's thank Jamie so much.
Thanks, guys.
Well done, Jamie. Thanks so much.